Have you ever stopped to think about how differently each of us experiences the world, especially when it comes to something really personal, like our mental well-being?
Mm-hmm.
It can feel uh, like a real puzzle sometimes, trying to understand all the different pieces that come into play when someone's looking for support.
Yeah, definitely.
Have you ever wondered what the absolute key things are that professionals keep in mind, to make sure they're really helping people from all walks of life?
That's the fascinating challenge we're tackling today, actually. Think of this as us sort of sifting through the most important pieces of that puzzle for you.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we've gathered, a collection of really insightful academic research to get down to the core concepts, the essential ideas for providing effective mental health services to diverse populations.
Right. And our goal is really to extract the most vital information, the core stuff, and present it in a way that's, clear and engaging.
We want to give you a solid foundation, a way to grasp these really important ideas without feeling overwhelmed by all the dense academic language.
Exactly, a shortcut, maybe.
Yeah, a shortcut to being well-informed. And we're going to be covering quite a bit of ground.
Hmm.
We'll explore what cultural competence truly means, look at some rich traditions of indigenous healing, how people adapt when moving between cultures. So it's acculturation,
Right.
and those fundamental worldviews that shape how we see everything. We'll also touch on the real impact of things like oppression and prejudice.
So, yeah, a lot to unpack.
Definitely. Let's dive in.
Okay, let's begin with a concept that really forms the bedrock here, cultural competence. Sue and Sue offer a really useful way to think about this.
Okay, so it's like more than just being aware that different cultures exist, right?
Precisely. Yeah, much more. They break it down into three key areas. First, a deep awareness on the part of the therapist
Awareness of,
of their own assumptions, values, and beliefs, and how their own cultural background might, influence how they see the world.
oh, okay.
And it also means being really honest about any biases they might hold. The core idea here is therapists need to understand their own lens first.
Before they can understand someone else's experience. Makes sense.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process, that self-examination.
Right, so it never really stops.
Doesn't seem like it should. The second area is knowledge. Culturally competent therapists actively work to understand the worldviews of their diverse clients.
And that's more than just, like, knowing facts about different holidays or something.
Oh, absolutely. It means understanding the history, the lived experiences, the values of various groups, and crucially, recognizing the profound impact of historical and ongoing oppression.
Wow, okay. So you can't really help someone navigate their reality without understanding the forces that have shaped it.
You really can't. Yeah.
Okay. And the third component.
Skills. This is where understanding translates into action. Culturally competent therapists don't just have the awareness and the knowledge, they know how to use it. They get that therapy isn't one size fits all.
So they adapt their approach.
Exactly. They're skilled in using therapeutic approaches and interventions that are genuinely appropriate and, effective for clients from diverse backgrounds. And they also recognize their own limits.
Knowing when to maybe refer out or seek consultation.
Yes, precisely. Knowing when to seek guidance or connect a client with someone who has more specific expertise. So it's this constant cycle. Self-reflection, learning, adapting.
Okay. Now, you mentioned Sue and Zane also highlighted two critical processes.
Yeah, this is really interesting. They talked about credibility and giving.
Credibility and giving. Okay, tell me more.
What's fascinating is how these two ideas kind of bridge that cultural understanding with actual therapeutic success. Credibility, as they define it, is the client's sense that the therapist is both an expert and someone they can trust. And trust, as we know, is just fundamental. Cultural differences can really influence that initial trust.
Absolutely. So how does a therapist build that credibility across cultures?
Well, Sue and Zane say it can come from what they call ascribed status, things like, the therapist's professional qualifications, their title,
Okay.
but also, very importantly, from achieved status. And this is where demonstrating cultural knowledge really comes in.
Ah, so it's showing you understand where they're coming from.
Exactly. If a therapist shows genuine understanding of the client's cultural background, it can significantly boost how credible and trustworthy they seem. It just makes sense, right? If someone gets where you're coming from, you're more likely to trust their guidance.
Yeah, totally. And giving. That sounds interesting in this context. What's that about?
Giving is about the clients feeling that they are actually receiving something valuable from the therapy.
Okay.
Sue and Zane even connect it to, the cultural practice of gift-giving in many Asian cultures, they suggest it can positively influence how engaged a client is, especially early on.
Like a tangible sign that something worthwhile is happening.
Exactly. Something is being exchanged. This giving can take many forms. Maybe anxiety reduction, maybe feeling like their experiences are normal,
Or learning new skills.
or learning new coping skills, yeah, or even just setting clear goals. The key is that the client perceives real benefit. It's not just about the therapist feeling helpful, it's about the client experiencing that help in a way that resonates culturally.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, let's maybe shift focus now to indigenous healing practices. This really highlights just how diverse approaches to well-being can be.
It really does. It feels like moving into, well, a completely different framework compared to a lot of Western therapy models. And it's vital to recognize that for many individuals and communities, these are deeply significant, often very effective ways of dealing with emotional and mental distress.
Right.
Sue and Sue define indigenous healing simply as culture-specific ways of dealing with human problems and distress.
Culture-specific, that seems key.
It is, and the underlying philosophy often is one of deep interconnectedness between the individual, their community, the spiritual world, a real contrast to the Western emphasis on individualism.
So these aren't just like alternative treatments. They're deeply rooted in specific cultural understandings.
Precisely. And and Mountcastle, in their research, found 3 common threads that often appear across different indigenous healing practices.
Okay, what are those?
First, a strong reliance on community and family networks. Healing isn't just an individual thing, it's often a collective process. Second, the integration of religious and spiritual beliefs and practices. They're not seen as separate from healing, they're interwoven.
Right.
And third, the significant role of a traditional healer or, a respected community member. This person often holds deep cultural and spiritual authority.
A very different model of support and expertise then. The source material gives some really interesting examples. Let's start with curanderismo.
Right, curanderismo. Practiced in many Latin American and Hispanic communities, it beautifully illustrates this holistic approach. It operates on the understanding that illness can have both natural and supernatural causes.
Affecting body, mind, and spirit together.
Exactly. Physical, emotional, spiritual health, all connected. And the healing is guided by a curandero or curandera.
And they use a wide range of methods, it seems.
They do, yeah. Often combining religious or spiritual rituals with traditional remedies, herbal medicine, massage, other, age-old techniques. It's truly integrated, addresses the whole person in their context.
Okay. Then there's Ho'oponopono, the Hawaiian practice focused on restoring harmony.
Yes, Ho'oponopono. It literally means setting it right. It's a traditional Hawaiian spiritual ritual, really designed to restore peace and balance within families by resolving conflicts.
And it's a structured process, often led by an elder.
Typically, yes, often facilitated by an elder or respected family member. And it involves more than just talking things out.
Right. There's confession, forgiveness.
Yes. Usually it involves identifying the problem, then open discussion leading ideally to confession, making amends, restitution, and ultimately forgiveness.
And there's often a symbolic end, like sharing a meal.
Often, yeah. To signify that restoration of harmony within the family unit. It sounds incredibly powerful, emphasizing reconciliation and collective healing.
It really does. And finally, the sweat lodge ceremony in Native American traditions.
The sweat lodge, yeah. A deeply significant ceremony for many Native American peoples. Takes place in a special dome-shaped structure built around heated stones. Participants go inside, water's poured on the hot stones, creates intense steam and heat.
It sounds physically intense. What's the purpose behind it?
Well, the heat and the sweating are seen as a way to purify the body, mind, and spirit, to cleanse negative influences.
But it's more than just physical.
Oh, much more. The ceremony often involves prayers, chanting, storytelling, other rituals deeply connected to cultural and spiritual beliefs. It's about renewal, connection to community, connection to tradition.
Wow. Hearing about these diverse practices really broadens our understanding of what healing can even look like.
Absolutely. And underscores the importance of respecting these traditions. Okay, should we turn our attention now to acculturation?
Yeah, let's do that. This is a process so many people experience when they move between different cultural environments.
Right. Acculturation, as Barry and his colleagues defined it, is about how much someone from a culturally diverse group accepts and adopts the values, attitudes, behaviors of both their own heritage culture and the dominant culture.
So it's about navigating both worlds, essentially.
Exactly. The key insight is recognizing the different ways individuals manage that navigation and the, potential stressors that come with each way.
Okay. And Barry proposed 4 main ways people do this.
That's right. Integration, assimilation, separation, and marginalization.
Okay, can you quickly break those down?
Sure. Integration, sometimes called biculturalism, is where someone maintains their own cultural identity and becomes part of the dominant culture, comfortable in both. Assimilation is when someone largely adopts the majority culture, maybe lets go of their original culture. Separation is the opposite, primarily identifying with their own culture, distancing from the dominant one.
And marginalization.
That's when someone doesn't feel a strong connection to either their own or the dominant culture, kind of caught between worlds, perhaps.
These categories seem helpful as a starting point, but I imagine people's experiences are probably more nuanced than fitting neatly into just one box.
Oh, absolutely. And other researchers have definitely expanded on this. Kitano, for example, looks specifically at Asian Americans, focusing on levels of assimilation and ethnic identity.
Huh.
And Finney and Davidovich Navarro, working with African American and Mexican American adolescents, identified 6 categories.
6, okay.
Yeah, including things like blended bicultural feeling connected to both ethnic and American identity simultaneously, and alternating bicultural feeling distinctly ethnic and American and sort of switching between them depending on the context, and also separated identities.
Interesting. And what did they find was most common?
Interestingly, they found those 3, blended bicultural, alternating bicultural, and separated, were the most common among the young people they studied.
That really highlights the complex ways young people, especially, navigate their identities in a multicultural world.
It really does.
Okay, let's move on to worldview. This feels like it's right at the core of how we perceive everything.
It is absolutely fundamental. Sue defined worldview as how a person perceives their relationship to the world around them. Nature, other people, institutions.
And it's shaped by our cultural background and experiences.
Exactly. And he suggests 2 key factors influence someone's worldview: their locus of control and their locus of responsibility.
Okay, locus of control, that's about whether you believe you control your own destiny, basically. Internal versus external.
Precisely. Internal locus means you believe you have control over outcomes. External means you see life as more influenced by outside forces, fate, luck, systems.
Got it. And locus of responsibility. That's about who you believe is accountable. Internal's blaming yourself. External's blaming society or systems.
You've got it. And Sue argues that understanding these 2 dimensions is crucial in cross-cultural counseling because mismatches.
Mismatches between the therapist and client.
Exactly. Mismatches in worldview can really create barriers in therapy.
Can you give us a concrete example of how that might play out?
Sure. Sue uses the example of, say, a white middle-class therapist who typically operates from an internal locus of control and internal locus of responsibility. We can call that ICIR.
Okay, ICIR. Believes they control things and are responsible for outcomes.
Right. Now, this therapist might work with an African-American client who presents with an external locus of control and external locus of responsibility, ECER.
So believes outside forces have more control and society is more responsible for circumstances.
Potentially, yeah. Now, the ICIR therapist might incorrectly see the client's perspective as, I don't know, a lack of personal agency or maybe even low self-esteem.
Well, actually.
When actually the client's ECER worldview might be a very rational, understandable response to systemic barriers and the lived realities of racial oppression.
So their life experiences have genuinely taught them that external forces have a huge impact and that society is responsible for many of their circumstances.
Exactly. The key takeaway here is the danger of imposing your own worldview onto someone else, of not seeing theirs as potentially valid and adaptive.
That's a really critical point. The potential for misunderstanding is huge if the therapist isn't aware.
And Sue also point out something else interesting. Members of minority groups might increasingly develop an internal locus of control, believing they can affect change, but maintain an external locus of responsibility, still seeing societal systems as accountable. ICER.
Okay, ICER. So I can make things happen, but the system is still the problem.
Kind of, yeah. And this can create challenges for those ICIR therapists. These clients might be more likely to question the therapist's authority, maybe mistrust them.
Seeing them as part of that system?
Potentially, yeah. Viewing them as part of the system that has historically oppressed minority groups. And they might be hesitant to self-disclose deeply.
It's a reminder that what looks like resistance might actually be a very understandable reaction to power dynamics and history.
Exactly.
Now, let's discuss a term that sounds, well, limiting. Cultural encapsulation. What does that mean?
Cultural encapsulation, yeah. Wren described it as when therapists essentially live within their own cultural bubble.
Okay.
They tend to define everyone's reality based only on their own cultural framework. They might disregard cultural differences or even ignore information that contradicts their own beliefs.
So kind of stuck in their own perspective.
Very much so. They might rely too heavily on their usual therapy techniques without considering if they're actually appropriate for different cultural backgrounds, and they fail to recognize their own cultural biases.
So the takeaway isn't just that it's bad, but that it actively stops therapists from seeing their clients clearly.
Precisely. It limits their ability to truly connect and help. It's a kind of rigidity that prevents understanding and meeting the needs of diverse clients.
Okay. The source material also touches on the difference between emic and etic orientations. This sounds like it comes from anthropology.
It does, yeah. Originated in linguistic anthropology, but used a lot in cross-cultural psychology. An emic orientation focuses on culture-specific theories and approaches.
Trying to understand a culture from the inside.
Exactly, through the perspective of its members. It's very context-focused.
Okay. And etically.
An etic orientation looks for what's universal or common across cultures. It takes more of an outsider's perspective, viewing people from different cultures as fundamentally the same in certain respects.
I can see how both could be valuable, but also how relying too much on one, especially the etic one maybe, could be problematic in cross-cultural work.
That's often the challenge, yeah. Finding the right balance and knowing when a culture-specific emic understanding is most important versus when a more universal etic perspective might apply.
Okay. Next idea. High versus low context communication. I think I've heard these terms before. What's the core difference?
These concepts, from Hall, describe different ways cultures convey meaning. High context communication relies heavily on the situation, on shared understanding within the group, and on nonverbal cues.
So a lot is implied, not stated outright.
Exactly. It tends to be unifying within a culture, slower to change. Many culturally diverse groups in the U.S. tend to use more high-context communication. The meaning isn't just in the words.
Okay, so it's about reading between the lines, understanding the unspoken stuff.
That's a good way to put it. Low-context communication, on the other hand, relies primarily on the explicit verbal message. It's less tied to the specific context, maybe less unifying, and can change more rapidly.
And this style is often more characteristic of Euro-American cultures.
Generally speaking, yes.
And these different styles can definitely lead to misunderstandings in therapy, right?
Oh, absolutely. For instance, the source mentions therapists used to low-context communication, expecting everything spelled out verbally, might misinterpret a client's reliance on nonverbal cues.
Oh.
They might see it as the client being unwilling to communicate, or maybe even lacking verbal ability, when actually the client might be communicating very effectively within their own high-context cultural style.
Right. It's a reminder to pay attention not just to what's said, but how it's communicated and the whole context around it.
Definitely. Now, let's move to a really critical area. The consequences of oppression. This has such profound and lasting effects on mental health.
It absolutely does. Landrum and Batts look specifically at the effects of racial oppression on African Americans' mental health. They identified several potential consequences.
Right.
One is internalized oppression. This is where individuals might internalize the negative messages and stereotypes from the oppressive system.
And how does that show up?
It can manifest in different ways, like system beating, kind of acting out against the system, or system blaming, maybe avoiding white people, or even denying the political significance of race altogether.
Denying the political significance of race. That's interesting. How might that look?
Well, Landrum and Batts suggest it could be seen in efforts to gain acceptance through, say, conspicuous consumption, or using education just for personal status rather than broader change, or even escapist behaviors like substance use.
So kind of coping by trying to find individual worth within a fundamentally unfair system.
Yeah, that sounds like a fair interpretation, yeah.
Yeah.
What other consequences did they discuss?
They also talked about conceptual incarceration, essentially adopting a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant worldview as a way to survive or fit in.
Wow.
And then there's the split self syndrome. This sounds particularly damaging. It's where a person internalizes the racial hierarchy so much they divide their identity into good parts, often associated with whiteness, and bad parts, associated with their own African American identity.
Gosh, that sounds incredibly psychologically harmful. And Sue also discuss survival mechanisms, things people might develop in response to oppression.
Yes, they talk about things like playing it cool and the Uncle Tom syndrome.
Okay, can you explain those?
Sure. Playing it cool basically refers to consciously hiding anger or other emotions that might be seen as threatening by the dominant group. Acting composed, calm, maybe unemotional.
Right. And the Uncle Tom syndrome.
That involves adopting a passive, maybe overly agreeable, or even a happy-go-lucky kind of demeanor. It's seen as a way to avoid conflict or potential harm when interacting with the dominant group.
It's just heartbreaking to think about the psychological load of constantly navigating an oppressive system.
It really is, and the ways people adapt just to protect themselves. This leads us pretty directly to the important distinction between cultural versus functional paranoia, especially when working with African American clients.
Right, this framework from Ridley, it seems really key for understanding why a client might be hesitant to open up in therapy.
Exactly. Ridley differentiates between cultural paranoia, which he sees a healthy adaptive response to racism, where a client might be reluctant to disclose to a white therapist because of fear of being hurt or misunderstood.
Okay, a healthy reaction to real experiences.
Yes. Versus functional paranoia, which is more of a general unhealthy mistrust of all people, including therapists from their own background.
And the danger is,
The critical danger is that mental health professionals, who are often white, might mistake this healthy, understandable cultural paranoia for pathological functional paranoia.
and that misinterpretation could lead to real problems. Wrong diagnosis, wrong treatment approach.
Absolutely. So, to help clarify this, Ridley came up with a model, 4 disclosure modes, based on whether someone is high or low on functional and cultural paranoia.
Okay, let's walk through those 4 modes.
Right. First, the intercultural non-paranoiac disclosure. Low functional, low cultural paranoia. This client is generally willing to share with therapists of any background.
Yeah, pretty open.
Second, the functional paranoiac. High functional paranoia, but low cultural paranoia. Their reluctance to disclose stems mainly from a general mistrust, not specifically related to the therapist's race.
So the issue is broader trust, not race-based mistrust.
Exactly. Third, the healthy cultural paranoiac. Low functional paranoia, high cultural paranoia. This client is likely to be open with, say, a black therapist, but cautious or reluctant with a white therapist due to concerns about racism or the therapist's attitudes.
Makes sense, the healthy adaptive response we talked about.
Right. And finally, the confluent paranoiac. High on both functional and cultural paranoia. They're reluctant to disclose with therapists of any background due to a combination of general mistrust and the effects of racism.
That's a really helpful breakdown of the different reasons behind non-disclosure. And Ridley also suggests different therapeutic approaches for each type.
He does. For the functional paranoiac, therapy needs to focus on those underlying trust issues. The therapist's race is less critical than their skill in treating paranoia.
Okay.
For the healthy cultural paranoiac, therapy should explore their experiences with racism and help them develop what he calls disclosure flexibility.
Disclosure flexibility, meaning
Meaning the ability to assess when it's safe and appropriate to self-disclose. The therapist being open about their own perspectives might also help build trust here.
right. And for the confluent paranoiac.
Treatment needs to tackle both the general mistrust and the impact of racism. Having a therapist from the same racial or ethnic group might be particularly helpful for building that initial trust.
It really underlines the need to tailor the approach, to understand the why behind a client's disclosure patterns. The source also gives some really sobering examples of how this cultural mistrust plays out in actual healthcare settings.
Yes, it does. Research has shown it can have really significant consequences. For instance, Joe, Canetto, and Romer suggest it might limit how effective suicide prevention programs are for minority youth.
Wow.
There's also evidence suggesting that the reluctance of some older African Americans to use hospice care or accept DNR orders or fill out advance directives.
It isn't just about lack of information.
Not always, no. It can stem from a deep-seated distrust of a healthcare system that has historically treated them unfairly, sometimes abusively. These examples really hit home the tangible, sometimes life-or-death consequences.
Absolutely. Okay, finally, let's touch on the concepts of sexual stigma, heterosexism, and sexual prejudice. Herrick argues these terms are more precise than just using homophobia.
That's right. He makes a case for understanding these as distinct but related ideas.
So what's sexual stigma?
Sexual stigma refers to the sort of overarching societal negative regard for anything non-heterosexual identities, behaviors, relationships, communities. It creates this power imbalance where heterosexuality is seen as the norm, the default, and superior.
Okay, so it's like the general negative social atmosphere.
Exactly. Then heterosexism is more about the systems that uphold that negativity.
How so?
Heterosexism refers to the cultural ideologies, the underlying belief systems, the structures that promote antipathy, hostility, violence against homosexual individuals. It's often embedded in our language, our laws, social institutions, often portraying sexual minorities as deviant or threatening.
So heterosexism is the system that reinforces the stigma,
Yeah.
and sexual prejudice. That's about individual attitude.
Yes, exactly. Sexual prejudice refers to negative attitudes held by individuals, specifically based on sexual orientation. Herrick notes that while attitudes don't always perfectly predict behavior,
Wow.
higher levels of sexual prejudice are linked to negative reactions towards gay individuals, support for discriminatory policies, and actual discriminatory actions.
And research has identified some patterns. Who tends to hold higher levels of sexual prejudice?
Yes, Herrick's research and others has generally found higher levels among heterosexual men compared to heterosexual women. Also among older individuals, those with lower levels of education, people living in more rural areas or certain regions like the South or Midwest.
And those with less personal contact with gay people.
And those with limited personal contact, yes. Other studies have also linked higher prejudice to things like authoritarianism, fundamentalist religious beliefs, and conservative political views.
Understanding these distinct terms, stigma, heterosexism, prejudice, seems really important for anyone working towards inclusion, and especially for mental health professionals supporting LGBTQ+ individuals.
Absolutely. The source material even includes a study tip emphasizing how crucial all these topics are for understanding clinical psychology today.
That really just underscores the relevance of everything we've been digging into here.
It really does. Understanding these terms, these concepts, it provides such a vital foundation for navigating the complexities of working with diverse individuals, for providing truly effective, culturally sensitive mental health services.
This has been, wow, a really insightful deep dive into a critical area. We've covered so much important ground, from cultural competence and indigenous healing to acculturation, worldviews, the impact of oppression, cultural paranoia, sexual stigma. It's a lot.
It is. But it's clear that providing effective support really requires this deep, ongoing engagement with all these multifaceted concepts.
And hopefully this conversation has maybe given folks a clearer, more concise understanding of these essential elements.
That's the goal.
So as you go forward from here, maybe take a moment to consider how these concepts might be playing out in your own interactions, how they shape your understanding of the world.
Yeah, think about which ideas sparked the most thought or maybe raised more questions for you.
Because becoming aware of these dynamics, really that's the crucial first step towards a more inclusive and, well, a truly understanding perspective. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.